Cool. So, Adam Deeves' final video project for macroeconomics, and my topic is the historical origins of the Federal Reserve, basically how we got to today's system. So it all starts in late 1700s with two guys, Jefferson and Hamilton. Jefferson, wealthy plantation owner, Southerner, hated the English, very pro-France, wanted a small government, and very in favor of states' rights. Naturally, he and his constituents were the Democratic Republicans. They favored strict interpretation of the Constitution, a weak central government, and the purest principles of democracy, and they associated with the common man. Hamilton, on the other hand, he and his affiliates didn't like the common man. In fact, they thought the common man was incapable of self-governing. So they believed the government should be run by elites who could tell everybody else what to do. This attracted support from a bunch of wealthy people, merchants, bankers, importers, a lot of English. And they sought to establish a national economy kind of in line with what England had. This revolved around mercantilism and manufacturing. Likewise, they were in favor of the commercial development of the U.S., and they wanted to promote this through subsidies, bounties, and protect industry with tariffs. So a lot of taxation, which is ironic, but I digress. So obviously, this type of economy necessitated a central bank. The concept of a central national bank basically epitomized everything Jefferson disliked. Centralizing the banks would limit citizens' economic freedoms, as in they would be forced to an allegiance to a singular financial institution and its policy. A policy which, under Hamilton's direction, heavily favored big business, large corporations. So steadfast in their belief, Democratic Republicans believed the national bank would be unconstitutional. And so just as the Federalists argued under the Necessary and Proper Clause that the basically government needed this for the country to function, they believed the federal government had the authority to conceive such an institution. So Jefferson actually envisioned an agrarian economy for America's future, so very at odds with the big bank and government. So this is the big year. 1791, Hamilton proposed that the United States charter a central national bank in order to take care of Revolutionary War debt and create a single national currency, as well as stimulate and regulate the economy. At the time, Federalists, Hamilton's group, were a very powerful political entity. John Jay, John Adams, Washington himself, all Federalists. As a result, powers that be favored the plan, and the bank moved forward. The plan employed taxes as a means to pay off the debt, calling for a 5% revenue tax on a revenue tax, and a 5% tax on goods coming into the U.S., as well as a whiskey tax. Obviously, Jefferson and the Republicans hated this. Jefferson wanted 50% of the value. Sorry, misspoke. So fast forward. 1810s. Concerns about the nation's financial stability have remained, and President James Madison and the Republican majority Congress elected not to renew the charter of the National Bank of the United States when it expired in 1811. So we're without a bank. And then the War of 1812 breaks out, and the economy is shattered because there's no national bank, nothing to stimulate the economy, fund these war efforts, and take care of any reparations. So the states began chartering banks, and these banks remained, but they lacked the credit and kind of industrial power to support the post-war economy in War of 1812. So consequently, second bank, 1816, funny how quickly things move, and Congress supplied 1/5 of the bank's $35 million reserve, which is, an astronomically small number compared to today's balance sheet. The bank was detested pretty much by everybody. It was a symbol of power and privilege. And, of course, there's McCulloch v. Maryland. Maryland tried to counter the bank. They didn't want to pay the taxes. And then later on, the bank was destroyed by Andrew Jackson in what he declared was his greatest accomplishment. Fast forward. We're going to be talking about the Federal Reserve Act. This is important stuff. So, European immigrants of the late 19th century and early 20th century fantasized of an America with streets paved in gold. Instead, they were just tar and stone. And America was locked in a vicious and extreme boom-bust cycle. Having not had a central bank since 1841, the U.S. economy relied on small regional banks and gold and silver-backed banknotes to support its financial system. While this system functioned, it was characterized by immobile reserves and inelastic credit. Banks of the day placed their excess reserves in larger central depositories. And when small banks needed to withdraw amounts greater than their local reserve, they were covered on credit of larger banks, which is a system that works. It's similar to the federal funds exchange between banks, the federal funds market, the interbank monetary exchange. The problem with this, no central bank supporting all this monetary transaction, is that during occasional spurts of distrust in banknotes, because no central bank, every state has its own bank, amongst the population, caused a run on the banks, and down the toilet. Banking system down the toilet. And because reserves were immobile and credit was inelastic because of just regional state banks, they couldn't meet the demand. So again, run on banks, banking system collapses. Institutions defaulted, and financial crises ensued. We had like 4 in between 1841 to 1913. During the particularly rough financial crisis of 1907, J.P. Morgan, who had aided the government in the previous crisis of 1895 to stabilize the banking system with a stimulus of investment and credit. And this proved a turning point in the economic system. Kind of everybody realized that we needed a central bank. On May 30th, 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act, and it established the National Monetary Commission. And their job was basically to resolve the banking issue, provide a reserve of liquid assets, control inflation, and strengthen credit. 4 years later, Aldrich Plan was presented to Congress. It created a National Reserve Association, a network of about 15 regional institutions. The plan, this is interesting for history buffs, and going back to J.P. Morgan, the plan is believed to have largely been influenced by a secret meeting on J.P. Morgan's Jekyll Island in 1910. It was all bankers and government officials. 1912 election saw the Democratic Party retake control of the presidency, and because the Aldrich Plan was Republican developed, just like with today's wonderful government, it just got shut down. Can't work together. So here comes Representative Carter Glass. He's tasked with revising the plan, and his plan ended up being almost the exact same thing. He proposed a single head instead of multiple heads of the banking system, and had it acting in a coordinating function between all 12 regional banks. Through the legislative process, a few changes were made. There were term limits, so no president could appoint the entire board within his two-term presidency. Fast forward, 1913. The Federal Reserve Act passed by a vote of 298 to 60 in the House of Representatives and a measure of 43 to 25 in the Senate. On October 23, 1913, President Wilson signed the bill into law, creating the Federal Reserve System we have today, which has remained pretty much unchanged. The private financial sector, just like last time, detested the legislation. It only allowed for a single member of the Federal Reserve to represent the banking community. Hence, the pro-banker Republicans did not support it. The bill instituted 12 semi-autonomous regional banks, the same ones we have today: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Dallas, and San Francisco. Banks were all controlled by a board-approved president, but technically owned by private commercial banks. Thusly, the Federal Reserve Act created a private banking system that operated in public interest. Bankers operate the regional reserves under the supervision of the government, specifically the Secretary of the Treasury, Comptroller of Currency, and the rest of the Federal Board. In practice, both then and now, the Federal Reserve is tasked with supporting the largest economy in the world. The Fed, as it's informally known, is equipped with tools for affecting the economy. Via the banking system, the Fed affects the state economy through monetary policy. It has the ability to buy and sell long-term government bonds and securities at will to private banks and the public. For example, should the Fed decide to increase the overall money supply on the open market, perhaps during a crisis, the Fed simply buys back bonds, subsequently increasing revenues in commercial banks, excess reserves, putting more money out there to be loaned for businesses, more business spending, more aggregate demand, greater GDP. The Fed also affects monetary policy through the reserve ratio, which is, as we all know, the amount of money, that you must keep in the amount of assets held in comparison to liabilities. Lower reserve ratio, more funds available. Higher reserve ratio, less funds available to loan. Likewise, the Fed also controlled the discount rate, the interest rate at which the Fed charges a bank for a loan. Wasn't really important until we hit the recession. It is through these means that the Fed adjusts the balances of the American economy. A perfect monetary policy achieves three things: a favorable balance between economic growth, low inflation, and a low rate of unemployment. And when deciding on monetary policy, the Fed has the balance to increase the money supply and how it affects major economic indicators of real GDP, inflation, and unemployment. And by creating balanced monetary policy, the Fed can effectively continue economic growth while lowering inflation and maintaining a healthy unemployment rate. And prior to the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, no American banking system had lasted more than 25 years, and it's amazing we made it that far. The enduring system is the one we have today. It's frighteningly unchanged. And that's how we got here.